So welcome everyone to this lunchtime training where we're going to talk about a safer approach when children are exposed to domestic violence abusers. My name is Joyce Yedlosky. I'm one of two team coordinators with the West Virginia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and I come to you with over 35 years experience of working in some capacity with victims of domestic violence. And pertaining to what I'm talking about today, since 1999, I've been at the coalition working on the co-occurrence of domestic violence and child victimization, and have sat on some national panels looking at domestic violence and child custody in both the family court as well as a child welfare setting. I'm also a national trainer for the SAFeR model that I will be presenting today. And presenting with me is Raymie, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Raymie White. I'm the Legal Services Coordinator for the Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And prior to that, I was a prosecutor and a public defender, and in both of those roles, I did most of the child abuse cases in the county.
Thanks, Raymie. And sitting in with us is one of our coordinators, the Protective Services Coordinator, Jessica Bender. If you'll introduce yourself, Jessica.
Good afternoon. I'm Jessica Bender. I'm the Protective Services Coordinator for the Coalition as of this past September.
All right. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the presentation by sharing my screen with y'all. So let me get the presentation up. Okay, so we are going to be talking about the SAFeR approach when children are exposed to domestic violence abusers. And as soon as I get my slides to advance, we'll move on. There we go. Just a little disclaimer as to how this project is funded, and that what we say is not necessarily representation of the Department of Justice and the Office on Violence Against Women. So what we hope to accomplish today is to identify elements of this new model called the SAFeR model, and I'll go through all of the elements in it, that helps with people who have to make decisions in determining the impact of children's exposure to domestic violence offenders. And this model should help develop case strategies that really account for the full nature and context of what is happening in each specific family, and help GALs to understand how to use the tools in the work that you do to better communicate the nature and extent of domestic violence in court proceedings that you are involved in. So the first question kind of I have for you all, maybe you can answer in the chat, is when thinking about the impact of children's exposure to domestic violence offenders, first of all, what types of cases will you need to make that determination on? Give me some types of cases, such as in divorce proceedings, or just where you have been involved, where you've been asked to make some kind of determination. And Raymie, if you just let me know what folks put in the chat. All right.
See nothing so far, but I could also not know how to do the chat. There we go. Divorce and custody.
Okay. That's probably the majority of you. And we're going to talk about the 50-50 custody here in a little bit. So let me ask this question, which may be the better question. How are you making that determination now? How do you use a tool? Do you go based on your training and experience? How do you determine what this impact is now? Just a couple words about what that looks like for you.
Um, Based on the statutes, the case law, and their past experience.
Okay, it's that past experience that this tool is going to get at. Of course, this tool isn't going to address what the case law says and what the code says, but it's going to address that experience and how you gather that experience and how you then interpret what you hear from the experience. And I think that's where a lot of people come from. Is there anybody out there who has a specific tool, evidence-based tool, that you are using to make this determination? And as you're answering that, I'm going to kind of move on. you can put that in the chat if you do have one. So these are the kinds of decisions which you all talked about, that where somebody needs to make a decision that relies on a good assessment of what the impact of the children's exposure has been. And so in family court, a protective order, parenting plans, divorce proceedings, and then the new 50-50 custody, which has many elements in it that where families are experiencing domestic violence might apply. Those decisions are also made in the child protection arena. The child protective workers use it in their intake and case planning and in their protection planning, as well as when courts are happening through improvement plans and even for termination of parental rights. So this model can be applicable in all of these types of cases. So a lot of family and child protection courts utilize some way of trying to grapple with what is the impact when children are exposed. And on a national basis, there were some folks that were looking at what was going on, and what the problem was is what people were experiencing, what the families were experiencing, often went in a different direction than what the responses were in family courts or child protection types courts. They seem to be in different directions, looking at different things, and we're not on the same page. So throughout the years, there have been a lot of ways of thinking about how children are exposed to domestic violence. Initially, it was thought of as children kind of being absent, that the domestic violence is just between the parents. And children weren't involved unless they were physically injured or sexually abused. Then we kind of evolved and said, okay, children are witnesses when they exposed, as though they're passive objects. They're there, but they're not truly involved. But what we know now is that children actively experience and resist the domestic violence. They are active agents. They are impacted directly whenever domestic violence is happening. So when looking at how people around the nation were dealing with this, there were some emerging themes that came about. There's some research I'm going to talk with you about in a moment, but these were some of the things that came in looking at families all around the nation. First of all, we were using a lot of terminology that wasn't clearly defined. Even domestic violence. When we say, what is the impact when children are exposed to domestic violence has a multitude of understandings. It's a spectrum. It's not one thing when we say domestic violence. We also use terms like high conflict, or parental alienation, or parental alienation syndrome, and psychological abuse, power and control. So some of this terminology has meaning, but it doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. How people are assessing and the assumptions that are made also is different. When I asked you in the beginning if there was a consistent way that you were assessing the impact, or if you were using a tool, nobody put in the chat that they were, to my knowledge. So there has not been a consistent way of making these assessments. And the information is not gathered in the same way, so it may not be reliable. So that left decision makers, lots of times judges, but also GALs who have to make recommendations, with poorly informed decision making. How do you gather the right information so that you can make the best decisions? And there was also often a disconnect with the interventions and services, because if we don't know what's going on, it's really hard to connect people with the appropriate services. Some other things that were noticed around is, first of all, as I mentioned before, not all domestic violence cases are the same. And I'm going to go through some different contexts as we move through the process. And not children are all impacted the same. There's lots of research out there that say when children are exposed to domestic violence, they may. And then there's some statistics that shows what children might encounter. But even within the same family with children who've experienced similar events, they still can be impacted differently. Their age, their temperament, their gender, all of those things can make their impact different. And then the other thing that's really important is that the impact on children doesn't stop when parents separate. There seems to be this assumption, there's misunderstanding that if we separate the adult parties, then we dissolve the domestic violence. And that is by no means true. As a matter of fact, there's lots of research that shows that lethality actually increases when the parties separate. So these were all assumptions and all problems associated with trying to understand what the impact of domestic violence was on children. There's other researchers that said that practitioners or people who are in the decision-making positions, their knowledge and assumptions about things like alienation or gatekeeping or even high conflict are more associated with their approach than what's actually going on in the parties. And so if people were kind of going on, well, when there's domestic violence, then there is, and there are some assumptions and beliefs, as opposed to what specifically is going on in this family. And that was a problem because that was not getting good information to the decision makers. So the SAFeR model was designed to kind of close that gap and to address many of these problems that were coming about nationally. And the model was developed by a group of people. So the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, the Office on Violence Against Women, the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts, Praxis International, and the Battered Women Justice Project. All of these are national technical assistance providers. They came together and they researched nationally some pilot projects, and they interviewed and tried differing methods in approximately 10,000 different families around the nation to come up with a evidence-based process to gather the right information to be able to help decision makers understand the impact of domestic violence on children. And this is called the SAFeR model. And so I'm going to make reference to this model. I have some pieces of it that are in your handouts. But if you want the full model, you can click on this link that's at the top here, and you will go to the Battered Women's Justice Project page where you will see lots more information about this model. All of the tools are there, including another video talking about how to use the tools in a family court setting. So, and I'll show you some of the tools here. So what is the SAFeR model? It basically has 4 steps, and as you can see, the 4 steps are color coded. And as we move through the tools, the colors match the elements of the step. So the first step is to screen for intimate partner violence. Is abuse even an issue here? The second step is, okay, abuse is an issue here, so what's actually going on? What is the nature and the context of the intimate partner violence in this family? Once understanding about what is going on with the family, then why does it matter? What are the effects of it for these children in this family? And then what can be done about it? What is the decision? So what this model does is it slows the process down. It breaks it into these steps. Instead of saying, when there is domestic violence, then we do this thing, or we respond in this way, or these are the 5 things we do when there's domestic violence, it forces you to go through and assess the specifics of what is happening in each family so that the purple area, the response, is based on information that was gathered when assessing the nature and understanding the impact. So that's generally what the model is. So let's go through each of those steps. We're going to start with screening. So screening for intimate partner violence is the first step. And there's research out there that says that when your screening is just looking for physical violence, then you're going to miss a lot, because there is a lot of violence that involves what's called coercive controlling abuse, where that abuse is beyond just the physical, but it is controlling all aspects of the adult victim and the children's lives. So screening for physical violence isn't going to be good enough. What screening is a routine process for identifying a potential problem. So it's not a judgment, it's tentative. It's kind of like when you go through the airport and you go through the metal detector. If it goes off, then you have to set aside and go through the next steps for seeing if you have any metal on you. So it's kind of like that. So you screen everybody to see if it's there, and then if it is, you go to the next step and look more specifically about what is happening in this case. The SAFeR model has a screening tool that is included in it. If you go to the website that I mentioned before, it has some screening questions that you can ask just to determine if domestic violence is happening in this particular case. And Raymie, do you want to talk about this?
Sure. The American Bar Association just says, and their recommendation is that you screen for domestic violence in every case that you have, every type of legal case, not just cases involving children or divorce or um, uh, family dissolution, but cases of wills and buying property or creating a business, because the coercive control elements can impact what advice you should give in those cases. So American Bar Association recommends that you screen for domestic violence in every case you have, regardless of what the topic is.
Thanks, Raymie. And just a pause here to see if we have any questions.
None listed so far.
Okay. So part of the screening process too is immediately if you find out that there is domestic violence on your first encounter, if you're working with somebody, it's really important to try to make an assessment as to whether or not this domestic violence could be potentially lethal. And this could be a whole other training in and of itself. In West Virginia, we have this model called the Dangerous Lethality Assessment Guide, where we assess that to find out whether or not domestic violence is lethal or not. And it is based on, again, on research. Research tells us that there are certain behaviors of domestic violence offenders, and if we specifically screen for them and look for them, then that will help us to determine which cases might potentially be lethal. And again, it's a whole other training, but this is the list of the indicators that may indicate that an offender is potentially lethal. And it's some of the things are common sense and some may surprise you, but use of weapons, direct threats to kill, if the victim believes that their offender might kill them, if stalking or strangulation is any of the behaviors that's happening, if it's very intrusive coercive control, forced sex or rape, if the victim is leaving, and I mentioned that before, everything here on this list is something the offender does except this one, which means if the victim is leaving, that actually increases their lethality. And if the offender is unemployed or has a child that is not the offender's biological child, and if the violence is escalating, and as with many things, substance abuse may exacerbate this lethality. So in the screening module, you first of all want to screen all cases, and then if there is any indication of domestic violence, screen for these lethality indicators. And I'll be happy to give you more information on the DLAG if you would like it as well. It goes into much more detail than what I just did. Okay, so we have some indication that there is domestic violence. So now we want to go to the next step of SAFeR, and that is to assess the nature and the context of the intimate partner violence. And what this step does is it takes a look at who is doing what to whom and with what impact. So what is the intent of the violence when it's being used? What is the meaning of the violence to the victim or victims? And then what is the short and long-term effect of that violence? So that is a lot of the information that is gathered in the SAFeR model using an interview guide, which I'm going to show you. It's in your handouts. So you're looking for these kinds of things when moving through the assessment interview guide. In talking about the context, I mentioned before that not all domestic violence is the same. And
Hey, Joyce.
research, yes.
Can I just ask you a quick question about DLAG real quick before you move on? Have you made this presentation to prosecutors? I can answer that. Yes, she actually made it when I was still a prosecutor, so that's been many, many years ago. And how do we get a copy of DLAG?
I will, I should have included it in our handouts. So I'm going to ask Sarah how I can make sure you guys get a copy of DLAG. I think it would be very important to do that. So Sarah, maybe you can help me with that.
I can gather their email addresses and we can send something.
All right, be happy to do that. Thank you for that question. Okay, so back to the context. As I said before, not all domestic violence is the same, and research tells us it tends to occur in one of these three ways. So the first one is coercive controlling violence. That's probably what we think of when we think of domestic violence. That's that power and control wheel that you hear us advocates talk about a lot. It's a patterned set of behaviors that goes beyond physical violence, where somebody has dominance over other people. They use many types of intimidation, some of which are legal and some of which are not legal. So the physical and sexual violence, but also psychological, name calling, financial abuse, using children, all of those kinds of things is coercive controlling abuse. Then when somebody is coercively controlled, they fight back, and that is called violent resistance. So this type of violence is produced and shaped by the coercive controlling abuse. So this is when somebody fights back in self-defense. It wouldn't happen if not for the coercive controlling abuse. So when you have two parties who maybe are both using violence, you want to look and see if somebody is dominating, controlling, and creating fear, and that the other party is fighting back, resisting that violence, either passively aggressive way or a very aggressive way, and possibly even using illegal violence to fight back. But it would be violence that was produced and shaped by the fact that they were being coercively controlled. So those two tend to go together. They both are perpetrated by any gender, but we tend to have more males perpetrate coercive controlling violence, and therefore more females perpetrate violent resistance. But again, it can happen in any gender. The third category is where it's not about coercive controlling violence, where you have family members who are sometimes using violence, but it's not a patterned intimidation. You don't necessarily have somebody with ongoing fear of the other. They're more on equal basis, and it's not about coercive control. It may be incidental. It may even be medical, where somebody's had an injury or they have some kind of behavioral health issue, but they're still harming one another. And so when we look at that context of domestic violence, we often find males and females perpetrate it at an equal rate, where there's no predominance one way or another. So part of the nature and context and part of the SAFeR model is to ask questions that help you make this determination. Is there coercive controlling violence happening here? Is somebody resisting that violence? Or is this not about coercive control at all? Is this a different kind of domestic violence? And so the interview guide helps to sift that out in understanding what is going on. After understanding what's going on, then you have to understand the impact of it. And so the third step is focusing on the effects. And when we think about that, we look at, okay, here's all the stuff that's happening. Here's who is doing what to whom. Now, what impact is it having? So if on a weekly basis, John is battering and physically abusing Jane, and the children are seeing that, what is happening with the children? Are they not going to school? Are they having nightmares? Just what is going on? And is it connected to the violence that is happening? That's the key to SAFeR, is being able to make the connections, not just saying, well, research says that children can have this impact, but to say, little Johnny has this impact based on this thing that happened. So you're making those connections, and the interview guide and the tools help you to make those connections. So this is an example of one of the worksheets. It is a bit overbearing on this slide, but it does, again, this is a forensic model. It has several worksheets, and this is kind of like a master worksheet. So if you look at the left, it has understanding the nature, like what's going on, and that's in the green. And then in the orange is an understanding of what the impact is. And when you look at the worksheets that they're at the end of this PowerPoint, you will see that each one of the elements of this master worksheet has an additional worksheet. So the abuse of the victim parent has its own worksheet. And within that worksheet, it describes in much more detail what are all the possible elements of physical abuse, what are all the possible elements of sexual abuse, and so forth. There's a worksheet on how an abuser may interfere with a victim, the parenting of the abusive party. That doesn't make the assumption that if you are an abusive person that you're automatically a bad parent. There are many elements of that that can be assessed. What is the direct experience on the child? And then what is the impact on safety, employment, and so forth. So each of these has a worksheet to help determine that. And then this would be like the master worksheet if it's already been filled out. This would be just a guide that is supported by interviews and detailed information that was gathered. So this is like a cheat sheet to get a good overall picture of what is happening in this family and how each of the elements are assessed. This is another one of the worksheets that looks specifically on the effects of the children. And so at the left-hand side, you'll see some of the things that were on the first worksheet, that you're looking at the abuse, the parenting, the interference, and then you're saying, how does that impact? Not was the child in the room, were they hurt? That's often what we look at, but that could be, is the child's physical child's physical safety in jeopardy, but what also about the child's emotional well-being, their economic security, their health, their development, their behavior, their thinking and perception, and their relationships. So things like when John turned the utilities off and Jane wasn't able to get them turned back on for a while, little Johnny's economic security was impacted by that. Little Johnny's living situation was impacted by that. So making those kinds of connections. And then after doing that, then you can look at your response, or what is your recommendation. So again, drawing linkage on here's what happened, this was the impact, and so therefore I am recommending these things that will help the impact, that will help address what this specific impact was on this family. So that's very general and very quickly what the model is. Now let's talk about the tools and how you can do it and who all is using it. So who can do it? First of all, anybody can go to the Children and Domestic Violence section of the Battered Women's Justice Project. That here again is that same active link. If you click on this in your PowerPoints, you will find all of the tools and more videos on how to use it. So GALs can use it in both the family court setting. GALs can also use it in a child protection setting. Custody evaluators, if we even have any of those private ones in our state, could also go to use it. And another group of people that use it are domestic violence specialists. And I've got a section talking about them in just a moment, but they can use it in both the child protection as well as family court custody and visitation cases. So let's go through how GALs and domestic violence specialists can use these guides. So first of all, there is an interview guide, and I'm going to show you very briefly. This is a little snippet of what an interview guide looks like. The full interview guide is in your handouts and also on the link that I sent you, but this is one section of it just to show you what it does. So first of all, in the blue, it has some questions that you can ask, and it can have the direct questions or you can paraphrase. It is a guide, and so it is just, this is what you should be looking at. And this first section is called personal interactions, but it has several sections. So not just interactions, but also physical violence, sexual violence, and several other sections that it encourages you to look at. Then in asking the question, then you go into the discussion, like here's what you might want to look for in the green area and ask about. And then in the orange area, it tells you what to listen for. And this is where you're already starting to draw implications right on the guide. So if we're looking at personal interactions, as we've gathered all this information, are we getting a sense that these are safe or dangerous, secure or fearful, and so forth? So as you move through the tool, you're starting to assess, and then I'll show you how to transfer it onto the worksheets in a second. I think we had a question, Raymie.
It's about access to the handouts. I think probably Sarah will have to answer that, so I figured we'd just wait till the end.
Okay. When you do get access to it, though, in your PowerPoint, which is a PDF, you should be able to click on the links. There are active links to be able to get to that Battered Women's Justice site if you need to. But you have to get the handouts first, I guess, before you can do that. So, All right, so that's the interview guide. And what that guide does is it basically structures the right questions and gives you the not only the questions to ask, but the things to kind of explore, and then what you should be looking for in terms of the implications of that. So when somebody's telling that something happened, you're looking for what was the impact on the children, on the adult victim, and understanding what all is going on. I think most of the time in the cases that I've worked with over the years, by the time cases get to court, I, as an advocate, often know so much more than what the decision makers know about what happened, about the nature and extent of the domestic violence. And we're already at the phase about making decisions, and we're not even sure what happened in the family. So the interview guide really helps structure asking the right questions to make the determination about what happened. After doing the interview, and you can document on the interview guide if that's what you want to do, there are also worksheets. Now, I don't want you to feel overwhelmed by all of the worksheets and all of the guides. This model was set out that if you are a detailed person and you want to use the full extent of the program, there are multiple worksheets and multiple guides. But if you also want to make some shortcuts and just use the pieces that you think work best for your practice, that you can do that as well. So they wanted to structure it in a way to give you multiple tools, and then you can kind of make the decision as to which ones are most applicable to the cases that you're working with. But after doing the guide, the interview guide, then the next step is to plug that information into worksheets to help you draw implications and then to make recommendations. And so this is yes.
Couple questions about the interview guide, Joyce. One is, does it take into consideration the age of a child so that age-appropriate questions are used?
So the interview guide is primarily used with the adults in asking them what the impact is. So this is, when looking at interviewing children, it is not a guide for interviewing the children. It's interviewing the adults for what is happening.
Okay. Second question is, if you are conducting an interview with the victim who is protecting the abuser, does it address that in some way, or what do you do?
Yes. So that is very important, to set up the interview in a way that you're making sure that they give you as much information as they can. So first of all, it's really clear to let them know what's happening with the information. And if you're a GAL, what's going to happen with the information is it's going to go to court, and their abuser is going to know about it. That's super important to let them know that. Yes, they might not give you all the information because they may be afraid to, because you're going to put it in court and the abuser is going to know about it. But that is the best you can do. They need to know that that's what's going to happen, because they also might need a safety plan to make arrangements for what happens when the abuser has that information. Another piece of this model is having it being used by domestic violence specialists, which are domestic violence advocates, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. Domestic violence advocates may be able to gather more information and then give that to you. It may be a different way of collecting more information in a safer way, because the advocate is then also able to safety plan and work with that victim after gathering that information. And they may feel more safer to disclose in that kind of setting. Raymie, do you have anything to add to that?
No, nothing substantial that you haven't covered.
Okay. Yeah, of course, just setting a safe space for to do the interview in a way that is not around their offender, and then being very honest about what happens with the information. You're going to write a report based on the information that is happening. So you just want to be really clear and disclose what can happen with the information, which I'm sure you would anyway. Okay, so this is the tool, that one of the worksheets, and I had given you this before. It's just kind of like a clean version of one of the worksheets, and you'll see the rest. You'll see many of them at the end of this PowerPoint, provided you've gotten the PowerPoint, and then there are even more on the Battered Women's Justice website. So the worksheets, what do? They structure the connections between, like, the nature and extent and what is happening, and they connect recommendations to the determined impact. So if a recommendation is somebody that, for example, you recommend that the offender go to a battery intervention program, you're going to want to determine that this is coercive controlling violence, and that you have some evidence that shows that coercive control, because battery intervention programs, that's what they address, is coercive controlling violence. They're not really helpful if the violence isn't about coercive control, and they're not geared for somebody who's using resistive violence. So that's one example of how you would connect your recommendation with what is happening what's the nature and the context of this family. It also helps you to structure your report. So if you're giving a report, you can make the report contain the elements that are part of the SAFeR model. So you can talk, when talking about the impact on children, not just the physical impact, but also all those other elements that I had shown you in the worksheets. So they can help in that way as well, and they can be used to help you make your connections between your recommendations and what was happening in the family. You can also use domestic violence specialists. So let me just say how you can use them first, then I'll say a little more about what they are. So you can request that a domestic violence specialist do a SAFeR assessment and that they give you recommendations. If you're asking for this, there's a lot of confidentiality measures that have to be taken because domestic violence specialists are under very strict confidentiality provisions, and they need either a release from the survivor, the victim, or a court order, in a very specific court order. We have developed a model court order that's in your handouts that clarifies what is being asked for, but it also clarifies what a domestic violence specialist can do, because sometimes we get court orders asking specialists to do something they don't do. For example, they don't do psychological assessments. They do this SAFeR assessment and they provide services. So the things that they do are on the court order, and you can select from the options on the list what it is that you're asking of for a DV specialist. Are you asking for a written report? Are you asking for testimony? Are you asking just for general information? So that's one way you can also use the SAFeR assessment. It's important to know that domestic violence specialists are only going to do this assessment with the victim parent. So where you as a GAL can conduct this assessment with both parents, DV specialists are only working with the victim parent. So it is one-sided, but it can be, again, a safer way of getting that information, because with the victim parent, you also have to do safety planning, because once you get this information and it becomes something that's going to be discussed in a court hearing, that can create a lot of fear for the victim, and there needs to be some safety planning that can go along with that. Some domestic violence specialists can provide expert witness testimony, and that can be done in a couple of ways. They can testify because they've done a SAFeR assessment, or they can also testify about general dynamics of domestic violence in a proceeding. And I have a list of where the domestic violence specialists are so that you can talk to them about what the best referral process is in your area. Was there a question, Raymie?
I'm answering it by typing.
Okay. I see them pop up, but then they don't stay. So, okay. So what is a domestic violence specialist? So in addition to doing SAFeR assessments, they are domestic violence advocates that are co-located. They spend some time in their program and some time at a DHHR office. They work to provide supports to victim parents. They do interviews and services, but they're also skilled in doing these SAFeR models. They can be an advisor. They can give their recommendations to both child welfare as well as to you or to a family court based on their interactions, again, with the victim parent only. And then they also participate in a CCR or a coordinated community response team. Here's where they're located. So they're pilot projects. They are located in a few counties, but they are expanding into some other counties. In a few months, we may see this map looking a little bit differently. But this is where they are right now. And Jessica Bender, who's also on this call, coordinates the DV specialists throughout the state, helps them to receive the training that they need and provide technical assistance, and to work as a liaison for folks who are wanting to interact with domestic violence specialists. This is a listing of the specialists that we have at the moment, and you will see this list growing. In Marion, we've got some new folks. Some of these folks are new, some of them are seasoned, so they are in training. A domestic violence specialist requires a lot of training. They require a 2-year certification process as a domestic violence advocate. And then in addition to that, they have to have training on the SAFeR model and how to work in a child welfare setting. So they go to trainings with CPS folks so that they understand that whole process. So it takes a good couple of years at least to get a DV specialist to full functioning ability. And we do have some new folks in this list who haven't completed all of that training yet. So
Joyce,
how
if I
did
could just add quickly on that note, some of the domestic DV specialists have previously testified as experts and have been qualified as experts. Some have not. All of them have been given some training on what it means to testify as an expert. And I'm happy to work with them individually. If you need them in your case and you don't feel like they're ready, we can talk about what they need.
Raymie, can folks contact you if they're seeking an expert?
They can. I have a list of the folks who are willing to do it and who are qualified, and I can provide that to you, and I'll put my email in the chat box.
Thanks, Raymie. So this is how DV specialists use the SAFeR model. First of all, that interview guide, they use it with every survivor, even if they're not going to court or they're, that's just the way that they extract information so that they can understand the nature and extent of the domestic violence, and they can help make recommendations for safety planning and services. So they use that guide a lot, or they will be using it a lot. They've just recently been trained on it. And then we're collecting some aggregate data. I mentioned it's a pilot project, so they are collecting data on what types of abuses occurring with the folks that they work with, and then going to be doing some surveys. And you may be asked to do some surveys that help with whether or not their work was impactful, helpful, helped with better outcomes. So we're working on data collection around this as well. They have a summary and recommendation report, and they can give that to survivor attorneys, victim attorneys, GALs, CPS workers, and then they can also provide the expert witness that Raymie has talked about as well. When looking at this summary and recommendations, and I'm going to give you some examples in a second, it is important to have a survivor release or a court order. And I mentioned that we have in the handouts a sample court order. So what is a summary and recommendation that a DV specialist might provide? So this is page 1 of it. There's also a back page. So if you look at this, it can give a quick assessment of what is happening and if there are any lethality indicators. I'm going to go into knowingly allow in a second. What are the immediate and long-term concerns? And then some potential responses. So the specialist actually makes some recommendations as to the offending parent and as to the victim parent. And again, this is all based on an interview with the victim parent. It is one-sided, it's intended that way, but it does gather information that might not have been gathered otherwise. And then on the back side of it, which you'll see in your handouts, are more responses as to the offending parent and to the victim parent. So that's one way that a report can be given by a DV specialist. So in that report, I mentioned it talks about the nature and extent, but it also talks about knowingly allowed. And I'm going to slow down on that for a second, because that is often what happens in a child protection case. Is a victim of domestic violence is often accused of knowingly allowing the violence. So this is the knowingly allow policy that CPS uses. If a worker finds the presence of domestic violence, he or she cannot find the abusive parent knowingly allowed the abusive behavior unless the non-abusive parent did not take any steps to protect the child that were reasonable, giving the threat posed by the batterer to the non-abusing parent. So that's the standard. And so a DV specialist can make a recommendation about that. And what they do is, because they've gathered the information, first of all, they can determine what the threat was. They can say, was there a threat of death? Was they under the threat of losing their children? Threats towards family? Were there threats in all the ways on the list there, and plus many more? And then they can, because they've done the interview, they can say, what steps did the adult victim take, and offer them up perhaps in a way that's different than somebody might think. So for example, staying could be seen as a protective measure. If an offender has lethality factors and says, if you leave, I will kill you, then staying is probably a good step if you don't have a safe way to get out. So that can be seen as a protective measure. So there can be other things that a victim may say that they did to try to protect their children. And then the CPS policy says, were these steps reasonable considering the threat of harm? So it was column in the middle, reasonable considering column to the left, threat of harm. And then the
Perfect place to stop you with a question. Does that mean there could be a determination that no reasonable steps were available to take?
no, none available to take or none taken. I think those are two different things. Yes.
The question is reasonable steps, no reasonable steps were available to take. I think the
So
key
that
reasonable
is
is
where staying could come in. So maybe if you couldn't leave, I didn't have an option to leave, there was nothing available to me, so I stayed. That's reasonable. I think that's what you're getting at. Raymie, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I thought that's what the question was too, that in
Okay.
some cases the person would stay because leaving or doing something else was not reasonable.
Right. And things that a person who isn't living in this situation might think, well, you should have done this or you should have done that. And drawing conclusions about what barriers the offender put up as to why they didn't do this or that is part of this analysis. I couldn't do this or that, but here's what I did. I couldn't leave, but I made sure the children were up in their room. You know, things like that, doing the best you can, considering the threat. And that's where the column on the left is so important. If you don't know what the offender did, it's really hard to determine whether or not the steps were reasonable. So a DV specialist can make that recommendation. They can make it to CPS, they could make it to you as a GAL. You could make a different determination because you may have more information, but this would be what they recommend based on the information that they have. And that's part of their summary and recommendations, is to make a knowingly allowed assessment. They also can assess based on their interview the impacts and recommendations for safety services, which I have already reviewed with you. So these referrals can be given to judges, GALs, court personnel, law enforcement, and other community agencies. So just to let you know that the SAFeR assessments can be done with other folks. And I was butting up against time, but we still have about 10 minutes if we have questions. And I think what I would like to do is stop sharing so that I can see if we have any questions from folks.
While you are typing questions, I'll add one thing. In your handouts, once we're able to tell you how to get to those handouts, there is an example of the report that DV specialists could create in your case. I can see a substantial use of that in court, where it explains what the history of the domestic violence in the home is, and then also makes recommendations. I think often in abuse and neglect cases, I am guilty of this myself. We had a list of these are the 10 things we're going to do to put every family back together, but we know the law says that we have to create a personalized plan to put that family back together where we can. And that DV specialist report really gave those personalizations, the exact steps that you could potentially take to put that family back together. And particularly in DV cases, sometimes we're dealing with a case where there are drug issues. And so we get focused on the drug issues and we forget to come back and work on the DV issues too. So we could potentially put a family back together that's not safe because we forgot to work on the DV issues while we we're fixing the other issues that were going on in the home. So I think those reports can be super, super helpful once you have a chance to look at them and imagine how they could be used in your cases.
Thanks, Raymie. I will also say that I presented this model to family court judges, and they stated that overall that they felt that this would be good information to have so that they can make better decisions. They also can't do these assessments, so they would rely on you to bring this information to them. And they were also questioning they had a lot of questions for reasons behind victim behavior. I don't understand why victims fill in the blank. And this SAFeR assessment fills that blank in. Victims will often say, I did this and here's why. And you get the backstory as to what was going on. You get information about barriers that were put up. I love the question about what, what if they weren't able to take any steps because the offender blocked them from that, or they were living in such fear that they are afraid to do anything? That kind of information is something that judges said that they needed. And this model, I believe, can bring them that kind of information.
Just a comment. I found this eye-opening. The assessment questionnaires will be very helpful in the initial client meeting. Let me just say one thing about the questionnaires as an attorney. When I first started working with Coalition and Joyce showed me this, I went, I can't do that. Literally that way, stammered around because there are pages and pages of questions. And then Joyce explained it's not just to like go through and ask the questions, it's to kind of help you have a conversation with your client. So then that made sense. But at first, when I looked at it, I was like, I don't know that I could use this. There are too many questions. I would just be sitting there like checking off boxes the whole time.
And let me just say that this was developed by attorneys. The Battered Women's Justice Project did a lot of the work on the worksheets, and the folks who did it were attorneys who had a lot of experience working with domestic violence cases. And so this was designed for attorneys to use. So I often say that that's why it's so long, but I don't know if that has anything to do with it. I'm obviously not an attorney, but it is very, again, I do like the aspects that you can use what is most useful to you. And you can then report back to the court, here's how I made that determination based on these tools that I used.
Another comment, it's a shame this cannot be used in modification cases where the victim signed on to an agreement that was obviously the result of fear. So I think you could potentially use this in a modification case. I mean, obviously not if there's already something's happened, but if you're in the opening stages of that case, you could use this tool in a modification case. Comment about asking about disabilities. I think that's always a good place to start, an excellent point to see if your person understands what you're talking about.
Yeah, I will say that that's why it's a guide. You know how to ask questions as an attorney. I think for general, I think sometimes with domestic violence, you're just not sure which questions you need to ask, or you maybe never thought about asking a question. And so the guide gives you the structure of the question if you choose to use it that way, but you would obviously want to ask it in a way that is best the way to communicate with the client that you're working with.
Another comment I only discovered that I had a victim of DV when I asked her why she had so much hair missing, and the abuser had pulled it out.
Yeah. I think that screening tool is really good. And I really love what Raymie said about the Bar Association recommending it with any case. Most victims of domestic violence are not going to come out and say, I'm a victim of domestic violence and proceed this way. Many of them will even deny being a victim, or they will deny it to you because they're really fearful about what happens if that is disclosed. They're really fearful. They're much more afraid of the offender than they are of what's going to happen in the court process. Any other questions? So on the PowerPoint is my contact information. Raymie put his in the chat as well. And Jessica had to go. She's in the middle of another training, but she can also be a contact if you need her for the domestic violence specialist. But I really encourage you to contact one in your area. And as you saw, they're not in every single county, but you can contact one close to you if you feel like it's something that you could take advantage of.
Have you noticed any impact from the implementation of the new 50/50 statutes on reporting domestic violence?
So we anticipated that there would almost need to be a higher level of disclosure of domestic violence because you need to use that to rebut the presumption. I haven't done any research around that to see if we've had more disclosures. I will say that our advocates are reporting many more barriers and problems as they're hitting family court, particularly when they don't have an attorney because of the new presumption.
If someone is, sorry, my chat jumped down there just as I started reading that one. If someone is overwhelmed by domestic violence, is that a ground for the appointment of a guardian ad litem?
I don't know the grounds for appointment for guardian ad litem. Rainey, do you?
Off the top of my head, I don't. My recollection though is there's like a catch-all, if the judge feels it's appropriate, but don't hold me to that because I can't remember off the top of my head.
Okay. And
Sorry, I missed one in the Q&A here. When representing the parent, are we not mandatory non-reporters if the client doesn't consent to the disclosure of child abuse? Yep, my understanding is if the client tells us as an attorney something, we keep that confidential. I think that's what your question is.
how about in a guardian role? As a guardian, you would report, correct?
Yes, guardian would report. Prosecutor would report.
And a domestic violence advocate, DV specialist would report.
Yes.
Is that,
Okay, that's all the questions I see. I would just point out, I put a link to the most recent DLAG in the chat, but we'll also try to get that around to you. And maybe Sarah could jump in and say how to get the handout resources if you didn't see those in your email.
They were attached to the registration, so you should have gotten them then. However, what I will do is pull the email list and send them out to everybody after the seminar today.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you all for your attention and for all the hard work that you do.
Thank you, Joyce.
Thanks, Sarah. Bye.